Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Eric Jenks and I am a photographer based in upstate New York. I just wanted to give an explanation on why it's been a little bit since I've done a video. I've had some health issues. I've had a heart condition that I have been dealing with for about a decade that was misdiagnosed. And starting in July, I have been in constant atrial fibrillation, which is not pleasant. Takes a lot out of you. I had surgery about 3.5 weeks ago to correct the situation, and I feel way better. So if you've been here before, thank you. If this is your first time viewing, I hope you enjoy what you hear today. And if you do, I'd like it if you could hit that like button. If you don't like it, hit that dislike button. Leave a comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. So what I wanted to talk about today is the death of the SLR. It's a subject that you see kind of clickbait titles all over the place, but there is a fraction of truth to it. Canon, for example, just discontinued their EOS 1 series so that they can focus on their mirrorless cameras, the R mount. It's a little bit reminiscent of when they discontinued the FD mount and switched to the EF mount in the late 80s. You're seeing a large push by the industry for mirrorless cameras over the SLRs, and yeah, so it's a thing. It's something that's going to happen. Does that mean that your camera is going to suddenly stop working and no longer be usable for the future? No. I don't think that SLRs are going anywhere anytime soon, especially with the used market the way it is. I think that, if anything, it might make the SLRs more of a bargain, if for the people who only want the latest and greatest. I personally still use SLRs for work. I also use an even older technology, Rangefinder cameras, for work. And that kind of brings me to thinking of something even earlier than that change from the FD mount, but the change from a rangefinder camera, like my M2 that I have right here, to SLRs, when that was the new technology of the day in the Nikon F. Fun thing, both of these cameras are from 1961. They were both incredibly expensive for their time too, if you look at it in modern dollars. The M2 with the LMR lens that I have on it, the 50mm f2.8 lens, would have been around $315 in 1961. That's the equivalent of about $3,000 today. The Nikon F with the 58mm, and yes, that is 58mm. This is the first version of the lens before they came out with the 50mm f1.4, would have been around $385, which is the equivalent of around $3,600 today. So the Nikon F was actually the more expensive camera to go with, which isn't something that we think of, often with the prices that we see for German lenses today. So it's interesting to look at what the production numbers were for the Leica M2 versus the Nikon F, because they both ran for a similar length of time. The M2 was produced in around 82,000 copies. The Nikon F, before its discontinuation in favor of the F2 in 1972, was around 850,000. So literally 10 times more Nikon Fs are out there, and there are variations. There's tons of different variants of Nikon F cameras by the time it was discontinued. So 10 times more of the SLR versus the rangefinder. And you've got to ask why. It's a little bit like the questions that we're asking of how did the SLR, which was a professional staple since the 1950s, start to fall to the wayside today for mirrorless cameras, which the Leica kind of falls into. The Leica is smaller, it's quieter, you can handhold it at slower shutter speeds because you don't have the mirror vibration that happens, and you have smaller lenses to go with it, equally as sharp, and there's just a ton of things to like about the M2. The Nikon F is basically a Nikon SP that has had a prism grafted to the top. It is fun, you can remove that prism, change it out for ones that have meters with it. There's a lot of adaptations that you can do to make the Nikon F do what you want it to as a camera. The lenses are bigger. They are typically as sharp, if not, sharper than some of those other 1950s lenses that you might have found for a rangefinder. That's debatable for some people, but they are very good lenses. They are a little bit noisier, but you have one big attraction, and that is you can focus through the lens versus focusing off to the side and looking through a set of mirrors to compose your image versus focusing directly through the lens. That means there's no parallax, meaning that you don't have to worry about framing as much. And it also means that you can focus much closer. It's easier to do telephoto lenses. So if you're doing stuff for sports or, something that requires you to use a 200mm or 300mm lens, the SLR is king. You can't do it with a rangefinder. They're just not precise enough. And I think those are the main draws for people. Honestly, I still love to use a rangefinder camera. I do enjoy, the compactness that comes versus an SLR. It's kind of funny, that was one of the things that people were preaching about mirrorless cameras, is that they would make them smaller. But when you look at the sizes of the lenses that have been produced for mirrorless, and you look at the sizes of the bodies that are coming out as professional, there's really no size difference. You're not saving a lot of space with going mirrorless versus the Nikon. So I think what we'll do next is, just a little bit more close-up on both cameras, and then we'll talk more. So I'm gonna set up the camera so that we can focus a little bit more on the cameras themselves as we talk. All right, so we're back, we're set up, and right now we are focused on the Nikon F. So this is an early F, being from 1961. It still has a lot of the early items that we would expect to see on the camera. We have where it says the original name for Nikon, and I apologize to anyone who's Japanese watching this if I mispronounce anything. Nippon Kogaku in Tokyo. What I always liked about that early Nikon signature, basically, is how that they use the lens elements to make up the logo. It is, I want to say, a derivation of what Icon Zeiss was doing at the same time. If you've ever seen or had the chance to handle a Nikon SP, S2, or S3, a lot of this top plate is very similar. You have a film counter, so 20 or 36 shots, since the back of the camera is completely opaque, unlike later cameras where you can see the film right there. I'm not going to take this back off because I do have a roll of film in it currently. And you do also have a film minder over here so that you can remember what the ISO is for the film that you have loaded. And unlike a Contax camera from Zeiss, there's only one release that you really have to worry about, and then the whole back comes off the camera. Self-timer, you have the lens release right there. And what was cool, and I didn't realize about this, was that right here is where it says FX, and you can lift up on the speed sensor, speed setter, for your shutter control, and change it to be F for focal plane, a red dot for another type of release, or you can rotate it back to FX, which is for an electronic shutter, which is all going to attach on this camera right here through the PC sync. It also has a spot for you to use this release basically as a cold shoe on the camera. You can slide stuff over the top of that for firing. Pretty compact when we look at it in combination with the Leica. We can see that they are actually pretty similar in size, which makes sense considering that the Nikon F was just a SP with a mirror kind of hodgepodged into it. Less hodgepodge, you know, they really did take their time in designing the camera, but we can see that they are very similar in size, especially if you were to pop an MR meter on top of the Leica. This is the mirrorless head. They also have heads that are called photomics, and they have all the metering gadgetry built into them. This does not have that. I prefer the look of the meterless prism. And then similar shutter speeds. This one can do time, which is nice, where you press the shutter once, wait however long you want, and then you can press it again. You can see on the top, there you go, how the shutters work. Similar things too, they both go to 1/1000th of a second. The Leica uses a cloth shutter, the Nikon uses a titanium foil shutter. They both have flash sync. The Leica uses a proprietary flash sync with a different spot for either using a flash bulb or for using it with a electronic shutter. Or, I'm sorry, electronic flash. The Leica also has this knurled knob versus the usually preferred and a little bit more of a modern style rewind on the F. This is a plain prism F. They did have Fs that came out as well that were the photomic heads, FT, T, FTN, so on and so forth. They're big, they're bulky, they make the camera very heavy, and I think they take away from the design standpoint, and from a functionality standpoint, I'd probably just rather use a external meter. Now, what this F does have is the early 5.8 centimeter lens. It's the 58mm f1.4. That was because they hadn't quite come up with a design yet for a 50mm f1.4 that would work with an SLR. The Leica currently has my Elmar on it. I'd probably be more appropriate to compare the Leica with a Summilux or even the Summicron. I do have a Summicron and I have a Summarit, which was the precursor to the Summilux. But I really like how pocketable the Elmar makes the Leica. Things that I like about the Leica, I do actually prefer how the Leica loads film more. I'm not going to open the camera at the moment because it is loaded with film. You have this little back door that pops open and the base plate comes off. I'm going to set the Leica aside for a moment and grab the Nikon again. When you look at the Nikon, you can see it's all just one back. And you have a little film minder right there, and here's your opening mechanism. The problem I find with the Nikon is that the whole back comes off. I find it a lot easier to stuff a base plate into my pocket than to figure out where to set the back. It does have the film sprocket assembly kind of built into the Nikon, which some people might prefer, but I honestly find the spool that goes in the Leica just as easy to use, honestly, if not easier. I find I kind of, and it could also just be because that's what I'm used to, but I find that I can set the film into a Leica while I'm standing, whereas with the Nikon F I do have to find a spot, sit down at a table, and pop everything together. But yeah, this was what you would have had a choice for as a, you know, a press photographer, anyone who is doing any sort of journalism in the late 50s, early 60s. This would have been a camera of choice. that you could have made your choice between. This actually being the slightly less expensive, this being the more expensive. I'm certain if you were to pop on a Summilux lens, this would probably exceed the Nikon pretty quickly, or at least equal it in cost. I don't have any film samples yet from the 1.4 lens. I just got this camera a little bit ago and I haven't gotten the film back yet. I do have experience with the later 50mm f1.4 lens, and that's a fine example of a 50. And obviously I have a lot of experience with the LMR, having owned it for quite a few years at this point. But yes, this was basically the turning point for photography, where people moved to the Nikon, to the SLR experience versus the M2 versus the Rangefinder experience, the kind of swan song of this being the normal camera that you would see people out with as a professional. Reasons for that, I think it honestly just comes down to longer focal lengths, the ability to change focusing screens, seeing through the lens, being able to focus closer, not having to worry about parallax. Those are really the main things, I guess, that stick out to me. It's more useful in a lot of different settings versus the M2, which is more of a candid and travel camera in my mind, versus the Nikon F, which is kind of your all-rounder. And I guess that's what we're seeing today with the move away from SLRs to mirrorless cameras. I almost feel like we've come full circle, where we're moving from this back to something like this. The exception to my mind being that the new lenses for the mirrorless cameras are absolutely giant, that they're building, because they're having to over-engineer the lenses to deal with the light fall off that you have with digital sensors. I think they both have their merits, they both have their places. I like the immediacy of being able to see on the back of the camera for what your ISO is with the Leica. Again, that's just set manually and it doesn't change anything. Both of these cameras lack a meter. You don't see a meter in the Leica setting until the M6, or, well, technically the M5 too, but the black sheep of the family. You don't see a meter in this body format until the M6, let's put it that way. With the Nikon F, a meter was built in as early as this camera, in a couple of years, basically. You had the metering head that you could just pop on. And I think that was a nice thing too, is just the ability to change this up for whatever circumstance it was that you were photographing. And I think that's what we're seeing today with the mirrorless cameras, is that they open a lot of doors for a lot of different people, photographing a lot of different subjects. And they also, because of how close, like the Leica, the plane is from the mount to the film plane, or, the digital plane, just terminology there, for the sensor, you can use older lenses, you can use a whole bunch of different lenses that go back for quite a long time, versus what you run into with an SLR. You have the mirror assembly that's kind of forcing the lens forward, and so that in and of itself is going to just change what you can mount on it, and it's also going to typically make the lenses a little bit larger than their mirrorless brethren in the old times. Nowadays it seems like the mirrorless lenses are larger because of how they've designed them to be quote-unquote perfect. We talked about the death of the SLR, but at the same time that this was becoming the new hotness, they talked about the death of the rangefinder. And here we are, where film Leicas are still exceedingly sought after. Digital Leicas are exceedingly sought after. They're both still used, and they both have their place in my arsenal of camera gear. So I think it's the king is dead, long live the king. Gear might change and the uses might change, but I think that it's not dead, it just smells funny. And it'll continue to have a place in many photographers' bags for years, if not decades to come. If solely for the fact that the number of lenses that were made for all of these different SLR mounts go back decades at this point. So the used market is just so huge that it's going to fuel a lot of future photographers' bags for years to come. I do see a point where in the digital realm you're going to end up with, you know, these digital cameras dying and not having sensors to fix or, you know, parts availability, but I don't see that being an issue for at least a decade, if not a little bit longer. So, you know, don't fret. Your Canon 5D Mark IV is still usable, your Mark II is still usable, your Mark I is still usable. Your Nikon's D1 through D5, you know, are all still wonderful cameras. And pay less attention to the hype and what the manufacturers are pushing, and use the things that you enjoy using. I think that's probably the main takeaway from these two cameras. So there we go. That was a quick kind of comparison between the Nikon F and the Leica M2. It seemed appropriate, given that was what was happening when the rangefinders were starting to fall to the wayside of popular usage and SLRs were coming into their own, to talk about as we look at mirrorless cameras taking over the SLR segment for both professionals and amateurs. I don't think that this is the death of the SLR, no matter what is being, you know, thrown out there in clickbait titles and in articles and things like that. The SLR is going to have its spot for a lot of photographers for many years to come, just like the Leica rangefinder has a home in many, many hearts and many different photographers' bags as they go out and capture the things that matter to them. I thought it was just interesting to see how similar and how different at the same time the SLR was to the rangefinder, and you could really make that similar case now for how similar mirrorless cameras are to the older sibling, the SLR. In fact, there's a lot of similarities too that I see with the mirrorless cameras and the Leica, the rangefinder, especially if you're looking at something from Fuji, their X Pro series and their X100 series are very blatantly inspired by Leica and the, you know, kind of feeling that you get when you use a rangefinder. I hope that this was something that you guys found interesting. If it was, leave a like. If it wasn't, leave a dislike. If there's something more that you want to talk about on the subject, feel free to leave a comment. I'm hoping to do more of these videos now that I'm feeling better, and if you subscribe, you'll get a chance to see them. So thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate your time, and I hope it was worthwhile.